weekly update. I have been noticing that by putting out a plan and having a strategic way in order to increase my awareness of my need for prayer, it has been changing things. It is becoming more of a first response. Whenever I notice that my attitude is wrong, prayer is one of the first things that I consider, where that was kind of a later thought process, where it used to be where that would be after I change my thought already, go ahead and do that later. And now it's becoming a more of a, not want to say a knee-jerk reaction, but more of a first response. This is what I really need more than anything else, and that's been changing. I have been sticking to my plan, and it has been great. A couple of things have been odd. I had set up the goal for the first week that I was going to start praying out loud, and that was more for me to keep on focus. And I will admit it was very odd to start with, going into my garage and praying out loud. It felt uncomfortable because I wasn't used to it, and it has worked absolutely to keep myself on focus. My mind wanders a lot if I try to pray silently, and that's just one of my own shortcomings, and so that has worked. Setting aside time on a daily basis has also been something that's beneficial because it puts a priority to it. It gives it something that it means more. So 2 weeks ago, we had talked about the idea of prayers for ourselves, or more specifically, me praying for myself, getting the log out of my eye, making it so that I'm focusing on God changing me, where I'm still a priority in the needs of God's providence. And then I mentioned last week that I'm going to start slowly extending that circle. And so I talked about family, not only my wife and my children, but also my parents, grandparents, and extended family as well. And I kind of lumped it into two major categories in the sense of individuals who are faithful and individuals who are not, because I wanted to pray for them individually. And this week, we are extending the circle a little bit broader to the church, the congregation here. And I think that prayer has a lot to do with the work that happens here. Paul hardly writes a letter without beginning his letter with saying that he's praying for them constantly. And he doesn't end the letter without asking them to pray for him in the work that he's doing as well. Prayer is a constant part of it. And so what I have is I have a whole other list, which is in the back for anyone who wants it, along with the previous two lists. This one's going to be going up in my garage whenever I get home, right next to my other ones, because this is going to be something that I'm going to try to work on a weekly basis. So the first thing I would like to introduce is the idea of truth and understanding. One of the things that is fundamental to any congregation is that we stand true to what is true. The world is always trying to influence us to change what we do. There is constant pressure for us to be more like the world, and if we don't think that the world hasn't affected the church over history, then we really need to take a look at both history and the church. We cannot be bending with current climates. We can't change with popular opinion. And Paul, as he writes here to the Philippians, there in verse 1, he begins with, I thank my God in all of my remembrances of you, always in every prayer of mine, for all of you making my prayers with joy. And then he mentions here in verse 9, and with you in all of my, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and the praise of God. I want to pray that we here at Colonial stand firm to the truth, that we don't waver, we don't change with political opinion or political ideas. I don't want us to be any different than the New Testament church. And that begins, I believe, with praying to God that we can be firmly rooted in truth and have understanding. Paul says that he prays always in verse 4, that here in verse 9, that they have knowledge and all discernment. I think we do a fairly good job on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights beginning our Bible classes with the prayers that we might be guided into truth and our hearts be opened and we can apply those things to our lives. I think those are wonderful prayers. And I want to encourage us to do that. And I want to do that on a personal basis as well. The next thing I put on my list is prayers for harmony and peace. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul writes to a congregation that has neither harmony nor peace. And with all of their other sins, with all of the problems that are going to follow in 1 Corinthians, he begins in verse 10 of chapter 1 by saying, I appeal to you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. It is becoming more and more common to hear of churches who want to agree on just a couple of small items, and you can practice your Christianity how you want to, and I'll practice my Christianity how I want to, and yet we can still unite under the same roof and to be just perfectly fine. And Corinthians were meeting under the same roof, agreeing on just a couple of small items, and there was just full of discord. And Paul prays and asks them that they are full of harmony and peace, that they be united in the same mind and the same judgment. And I wonder how many times congregations, whenever there is problems that arise, that personal prayers for harmony and peace go out the window. Whenever there's conflict, that I want my side to win, or I want my opinions to shine forth, or I want my way to carry forth, rather than praying for peace and viewing myself as being a peacemaker. On that same kind of similar idea, we looked at this passage last week in Ephesians chapter 5. Inside of the context of here in verse 18 or verse 19, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Verse 20, giving thanks to God. And then here in verse 21, that we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. There are so many conflicts that begin and are perpetuated inside of the local congregation because I want what I want and you want what you want, and neither one of us are willing to bend. Now, on areas of truth, there is no flex, there is no bending, there is right and there is wrong, and we are commanded absolutely to stand for the truth. But in areas of opinion and areas of want, we have a clear example here in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 21 that we should submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That my opinion shouldn't win out just because it's my opinion and I really like it. I don't think there's anybody who is immune to the idea of wanting what they want because that's what they want. But when it comes to my approach, I want to pray that I have a heart of submission. That if there's any conflict that arises because of my opinions or my desires, that I remove myself from that situation in the sense of I remove my wants and my desires to submit to you. Much like we talked last week about prayers for the family, where the prayer isn't, please make my wife a better wife because I want her to be a better wife, but just an honest help in that sense. This is a prayer that I change so that I can help the best. And when it comes to areas of purely desire or opinion, that I don't have a desire or opinion that isn't worth giving up for you. So I want to pray that I have a heart for submission so that those areas of harmony and peace are more easily attainable because of how I approach the situation. I also want to pray for the spiritual battle. Since we're there in Ephesians chapter 5, chapter 6 is just the next page over perhaps. If you're there in verse 10, Paul writes, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. He says this is what's standing before us, and this happens both on a personal level and sometimes even on a congregational level, where there's always evil that is trying to creep in. Each one of us faces a spiritual battle on a regular basis. Now, Paul then continues on to put on the whole armor of God, but I want to read verses 18 and in verse 19. He says in verse 18, in connection with putting on the whole armor, to pray all the time in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplications for all the saints, and also for me, that the word may be given to me to open my mouth boldly to proclaim the mysteries of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador to chains, that I may declare it boldly and speak as I ought. Paul makes the point that a critical and a key part of us, both as a congregation and individuals, to succeed in our battles and to put on the whole armor of God, is to pray constantly and to make supplications for all the saints. That I should be taking time on a regular basis to pray both for the spiritual battles that we here at Colonial face and of the ones that I know that you guys are facing. Now, there are some broad senses that I can pray for the spiritual battles that you might face. And there are some that I may know personally. And not because of my job, but simply because I'm a Christian. And I believe that much in the same way that if I'm doing my job as a husband, I understand my wife's current struggles and her current goals. I hope that me as a Christian understand some, if not most, of the current struggles and goals that you guys have. Now, I'm not anybody's confessor, and I don't claim to need or know all the things that are happening in your lives. But if I'm involved as I ought to be as a Christian in one another's lives, I should know some of them. And in those ones, I want to be specific. I want to pray as much as I can for you in your spiritual battles and the struggles that are happening here at Colonial. Because prayer is an absolute necessity for the spiritual strength, both individually and collectively. In the same sense, over in James chapter 5, there are individuals who struggle with their faith, struggle with various sins in their lives. And in James chapter 5 and verse 16, he says, therefore, confess your sins one to another and pray for one another that you may be healed. That is a key component to my spiritual well-being, is that you pray for me and vice versa. And again, the idea of confessing is not the standard typical idea of coming forward to the front line of chairs here, front pew, and confessing publicly the things that you had done in your past that you want the congregation to forgive you for. The idea of confession, I believe, is more akin to the idea of confessing to somebody individually or even publicly the things that you're currently struggling with, the things you want to be helped with. And prayer is a key component of that. And sometimes struggles are not sins per se, as we see here in James chapter 5, but there's all kinds of other things. There's other times where you just have hardships that you're dealing with, or big changes that are coming up in life that you want help with. And those are things that are going to go on my list. And I've left plenty of room in all of my list to keep on penciling in more things as they come up. In the same sense, as we look at there in James chapter 5, verses 19 and verse 20, there are those of the number that are no longer of the number. As we looked at in Galatians, individuals who have fallen from grace, who no longer walk in accordance with the truth. Or as James says here, if there's anyone among you who has wandered from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wanderings will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Sometimes there is a key principle of just out of sight, out of mind in individuals we haven't seen in a few months or maybe even a year or two, or maybe multiple years, that we kind of just leave them off our prayer list because out of sight and out of mind. And just because they have been out of sight, I don't want them to be out of mind. And they often are, because I don't put them on a list. And so I want to put them on a list. And I want to make sure that they're remembered. Because there's still souls who are in need of God's grace. There's still souls who need God's changing power in their lives. And just because they haven't been here for a while doesn't mean that they don't need it any less. And so I want to pray for them on a more regular basis in a way that I don't forget about them. Maybe that God might perhaps grant them repentance, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12, which leads to life. Over in Acts chapter 14, as Paul is making his way back from his first missionary journey, it mentions there in chapter 14 and verse 23 that after they had appointed elders in every church, with prayers and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. The Bible has laid out for us a very clear structure for how the church is to be arranged. It's a structure that many congregations are lacking. And one of the key components here in Acts chapter 14 for them doing this was prayers for the leadership. And I don't know what the future holds for here in Colonial, but I hope that a proper leadership structure is in the cards. I hope that that is something that's going to be possible in the future. And to that end, I want to pray fervently for that God would grant us the ability to have our congregation structured as He wants. I don't want to be complacent in just things are the way that they are, and we can't change that. God can change that. And I want to pray for better or more leadership. Leadership is such a fundamental thing both in our homes and in our community and our congregation. And when we lack that in any of those areas, we really suffer. And so I want to pray that we have the ability to have leadership. In the same sense, I want to pray for the families that are here, individually. What I mean by that is as parents. Deuteronomy chapter 4, there's two just very pointed passages in Deuteronomy, both in chapter 4 and in chapter 6, where God, from the very beginning of choosing a people, gives the custody of children over to their parents, in the sense of that's their duty to teach them. There in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and in verse 9, he says, "Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and make them known to your children and to your children's children." And he speaks in the same way over in chapter 6, that you shall fear the Lord your God and your sons' sons by keeping his statutes and his commandments, which I have commanded you all of his days. And then he tells them that they are to love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their might. And these words that I have commanded to you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. Inasmuch as we try to do other things to help out, of having Bible classes on Sunday morning and on Wednesday night, and the youth get-togethers that we try to do, and all those other extra things to try to get kids involved and knowledgeable about God's Word, it is still my responsibility as a parent to make sure that I am teaching my children diligently. I can't pawn that off to somebody else. And in that sense, I covet prayers as a parent. Every kid, as you know, is exactly the same. So once I knew how to handle Lydia, then Levi was just super easy. Insert giant eye roll here. And every age, as you know, is exactly the same. I had 3 years old covered just really, really well, but then neither one of my kids are 3 years old anymore. I don't know what to do. I mean, I now have to figure out how to deal with a 9-year-old, and pretty soon 9-year-olds are going to be really easy, but then they're going to be 14 by that point in time. And every step of the way that I need more help and more encouragement and more knowledge given by God. And so as I hope that people pray for me as a parent to do the best that I can, I want to pray for you as well, that you can do the best that you can. That you have the strength and the knowledge and the zeal to keep up the work. I mean, it's so, what is it? The farmer's work is from sun up to sundown, but the parent's work is never done. Ad-libbing a little bit on that one. But there's really no break. And you were given children at the age that you're given them, and you get to have those children all the way until the end. And that's a huge responsibility, and it's one that I feel greatly as a parent. And I hope that other people pray for me, and I'm going to be praying for you as well. In the same sense, as you go over to Proverbs chapter 1, I mentioned last week that I plan to pray diligently for my children, that they be guided into wise choices, that they would have a heart that is attuned to God. And in the same sense, I don't think that prayer needs to end with only my children. In Proverbs chapter 1, Solomon writes his book to my son. And it is not just his one particular son that he writes to, but it's children in general, it's individuals who are learning and growing. And here he says in verse 8, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are a graceful garland to your head and a pendant on your neck. My son, if a sinner entice you, do not consent." I will be praying diligently for my children, and I think I should be able to pray for others as well, that their hearts would be attuned to God, that they would be open to his instruction, that they would be attentive to their parents' teaching. How much good could we do if we prayed for parents, we prayed for children, and we prayed for the marriages that are here. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, he makes the point, "Let marriage be held in honor by all." And that has not been the case in our society for some time. I believe it was right around 1986 that most states passed a law that allowed no-fault divorces. And within 3 years, divorce rates climbed to over 50% from what they were. So by 1989, which I won't tell you how old I was at the time, it was becoming very common for divorce to happen countrywide. And that's been the case since the 80s. That's become more commonplace than not. And marriage isn't an easy job. Someone has to live with me for the rest of their life. That's a hard job that Brittany has for herself. And she needs all your prayers for her to do that. Marriages are the fundamental part of what it means for a family unit. It's the fundamental part of our congregation and for our society as a whole. And whenever marriages break down, you get to see that cascade effect all the way through to children, to congregations, and society. And the divorce rate is climbing. And I know that the statistic for 50% of marriages end in divorce is kind of a skewed figure and isn't an accurate representation of all marriages. But it is a high number. And if you haven't seen it creep into the church, maybe you haven't been looking. It has been creeping in, almost galloping into churches. I think we should pray for the marriages that are here, that they may be strong and they be committed to the things that they have sworn to God that they will uphold. I also want to pray for physical growth and spiritual growth. Over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul writes to the Thessalonians in his second letter, and he begins with the idea that he's going to pray for them for their growth, or that he should thank God for their growth. And there in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, there in verse 3, he says, "We ought always to give thanks to God for you, brothers, as it is right, because of your faith that is growing abundantly, and the love of every one of you for one another that is increasing." I think that we are a zealous congregation who is trying to spread the word here in Williamsburg. I think it's a wonderful thing. Growth is sometimes that is simply just out of our control. Paul says that he planted, Apollos watered, but it was God who gave the growth. And so we need to both pray for God that he gives us growth, and at the same time, understand that we ourselves have a responsibility for spiritual growth. There was, I don't know if you guys know the name of Ken Williver. He preached in Florida for a number of years and recently retired. He made the choice that at 70, him and his wife were going to retire, and they were just going to go and help out small congregations as they had the opportunity. Last year, they went to a congregation in Canada that was just maybe 15, 20 minutes down the road from where we lived and worked. And at the end of the summer, he wrote an article that was entitled, "Small But Not Struggling." Because oftentimes the word small and struggling congregation kind of tend to go hand in hand. Much like, I'm so sick and tired. That idea, small and struggling, usually are synonymous or ubiquitous together. And he made the point at the end of the summer that there's a small congregation in Canada that is small, but not struggling. And while we may be small in numbers, that doesn't mean by any means that we have to be a small and struggling congregation. It just means that we are small in numbers. We can grow and abound in our growth, as Paul writes to Thessalonians. And so he says we ought to always give thanks to God, as it is right, because your faith is growing and abounding, and your love for everyone is increasing. So we can pray diligently that God gives us both physical growth and not forget that God can also give us spiritual growth, that we can be sound and strong, that we can be a shining light to the community even though we may not be increasing in numerical values. I also want to pray for the current Bible studies and other efforts, not just for the actual end results of growth, but there's a lot of efforts that are going on. There's a lot of Bible studies that happen outside, and there's a lot of Bible studies that are happening here. We have kids' Bible studies on Sundays and Wednesdays. We have adults' studies on Sundays and on Wednesdays, and we have other Bible studies that are happening outside of meeting times. And there's a lot of things that are not Bible studies that are still efforts. Individuals who are inviting neighbors and inviting friends. Individuals who are constantly doing something to increase the likelihood that someone's going to be responding to the gospel. And I should pray for those things more diligently, that they be effective, that they might increase to the glory of God. And I want to pray for those things. In the same token, as Paul writes to the Colossians, there towards the end of Colossians, in chapter 4, starting in verse 3, or verse 2 actually, he says, "Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with all thanksgiving. And at the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak." As much as we try, God doesn't grant us a door. We may not have too much opportunity. Paul, after all of his successes, after being directly inspired by God with inspirational knowledge, with all of his history of success, with all of the congregations that Mac talked about that he has started, in the areas that he worked in, he still writes to the Colossians that they might pray that a door may be opened to him so that the gospel may be preached. And I want to be more diligent in my prayers that God open to us opportunities, open doors for us to preach the word here in Williamsburg, that more people, of the thousands of people who have never heard God's plan of salvation, will hear it. At the same token, as you turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, it is God who gives me the ability to work as I ought to. And he gives you the ability to work as you ought to. He makes the point there in verse 10 that he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. All the links along the chain that make up the work here in the congregation is completely and totally controlled by God. It is God who opens the door. It is God who gives growth. It is God who gives the ability to those who do work. And I don't mean work as in just my job, but just me as a Christian. All the things that go along with that, he says that God supplies seed to the sower. I want to pray that God helps me to do the very best that I can as a Christian here at Colonial. Paul makes the point over in Ephesians chapter 4 that each part, when it is working properly, nourishes and builds one another up in love. And the point being that the work that grows one another up in love is predicated on the idea that I want to work, that I want to do my part, that I want to do the best that I can. And it's God who gives me the ability to do such. And I want to beseech him that God will help me in those things. I also want to pray for the sick. In James chapter 5, there in verses 14 and verse 15, he says, "If anyone is sick, let him call for the elders of the church, and that they might pray over him, and anoint him with oil. And the prayer of faith will save the one who is sick, and God will raise him up." And I kind of broke it apart into three categories because sometimes they get overlooked. And there are ones that we hope and believe are temporary illnesses. Ones that we expect them to recover, maybe even recover quickly. There are illnesses that are chronic, either chronic pain or chronic illnesses that sometimes because they're constant or present, we forget about, or at least I forget about. And then there are sometimes illnesses that are terminal, ones that are going to be for the end. And all those times, sometimes because they're not hear so-and-so who's absent because they are currently sick, sometimes I forget about all those other things, the ones that are chronic pains or chronic ones. And I want to remember them as well. Something I forgot to put on the overhead but is on my list is simply to pray about the relationships here. There are all kinds of small, minute facets of working together as a congregation, getting along and agreeing and studying God's Word and working through those issues. There's also all the things that happen just in life that create problems, or create friction, or create tension, or even uncomfortableness. And sometimes those small things, because they're not the huge spiritual battles, I tend to overlook in my prayers. And much the same way that I kind of had that big lump sum category of just praying for my family and our relationships, I also put that here in the congregation's list. I want to pray that we individually that I do a better job of building relationships. That God helps those things to grow. Because that's a part of what it means to be a family inside of God's church. Just two last things. I want to pray for strength. That over in Romans chapter 16, as Paul ends his book, he kind of makes an end statement. Verses 25 through the end of the book is all one gigantic sentence. But he begins in verse 25 by saying, "Now to him who is able to strengthen you according to the gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ." It is God who's able to strengthen us. It's God who's able to increase us. And I hope and pray that God will strengthen us, both individually and collectively. And just kind of for the last one, I know that here in Romans chapter 15, verse 30, Paul beseeches them or appeals to them that they strive together with him in his prayers on his behalf for his work. And there's a lot of individuals we know who do work in foreign areas. A lot of Christians who are in foreign areas. One of the brethren this morning over at Happy Hill mentioned that there is a civil war that is breaking out in Zimbabwe. And there's a lot of Christians in Zimbabwe. And so praying for them is going to be key. It's going to be important for us. And so that goes on my list as well. So not only just praying for people here, but praying for Christians in other areas as well. And I hope that I've been making up a decent list. Like I said, there's plenty of room for me to change it and alter it and add in things as need be. But I'm hoping that the list is a selfless list. I hope that all of these lists end up being a selfless list. That I don't pray that I get what I want, but I pray that I get to be the person that I need to be. That I don't get my way, but I get to be what other people need me to be. And that I spend most of my time throughout the week actually praying for others, that they are blessed, and that they are increased, and that they are encouraged in those areas. And so this is my prayer list that I'm going to be putting up at home when I get back home. And Mondays are going to be devoted to home, personally, me. And then Tuesdays over to my family, both those who are faithful and those who are not faithful. And then Wednesdays are going to be devoted to praying for the group here. And I realize that maybe I might be portraying this wrong, that I'm going to solely talk about these things on particular days, but that's not the case. It is simply a way for me to really beseech God and to be purposeful for that particular day. All these things kind of come and go in all other days, but on a particular day, I really want to focus on this. I want to be very mindful and very thoughtful. I want to be very systematic, because these things are meaningful, and God's the one who really creates change in our lives. And I want him to hear my pleas on your behalf in all of these areas. And so this is going to be my prayer list for Wednesday, and I hope that you guys have been considering all the different things that we can pray for. I hope that you guys have been considering how to increase your prayer life. This is just my method that I'm working on in order to help make some changes, and hope that you guys find your own way. But if you guys would like the list, it is in the back. Number 840 is the song that Dennis has picked out for us. One of the great things about being a part of the church is all the blessings that come along with it. It's automatically, as Jesus said, having extra mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. It's all the blessings that come along with our group that is larger than just ourselves. But it only comes when God adds you to his church. And I know the group here, so we're not going to go into great detail about that. But you lose all those blessings when you fall away from God. And I've often wondered, how can you do that? I don't mean that in a derogatory way. But when I see all the blessings that we have here, and I get to look at your face and I get to experience all the love that I have experienced over the last 2 years with you guys, why would I ever want to leave that? And yet, I know in my life, I have in the past. I have made the choices to pull away from people and to no longer share those blessings, to my eternal regret. So my encouragement is, if you are here this morning and you are slipping away, or if you're no longer walking as you want to, and those blessings are not there, then make the change now. Receive all the blessings that God has given us by being part of the church, by coming back to him. If there's anything we can do, any prayers or encouragement, let us know as we stand and sing number 840.
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus.